Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to Congregation Agudat Achim's in-person and live-stream Shabbat morning service. My name is Rabbi Rafi Spitzer. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, get in touch with me. I'd really love to have an opportunity to get to know you. This morning we begin our Psukei de Zimra warm-up for prayer service with the morning blessings on page 10. As you might know, we've been using Psukei de Zimra, our warm-up for prayer, as an opportunity to do creative modalities of warming up. Sometimes we've done musical warming up, sometimes we've done meditative warming up. All of the different modalities are contained in Psukei de Zimra. This morning we'll be doing a little bit of study of a passage in our Psukei de Zimra service, in our warm-up for prayer service that's toward the end of Psukei de Zimra. So we're going to do a quick Psukei de Zimra, and when we get to the end, we're going to pause and really do a deep dive into this one passage. So please rise, page 10, as we begin our service with the morning blessings. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lasech v'bina lafchim ben yom uvein laila. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani betzalmo. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani ben chorin. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Pokeach Ivrim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam malbish arumim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam matir asurim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam zokef kefufim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam rokah haaretz al hamayim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Shasali kol tzarki. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamechin mitzadei gaver. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam ozei Yisrael bigvura. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam oter Yisrael b'tifara. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hanotein l'yaif koach. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavir shenameinai u'numami afapai. V'ratzon lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu melech avoteinu shetargelinu v'toratav. U'neinu hayom u'b'chol yom l'cheinu chesed rachamim b'einecha u'b'nei kol ro'einu v'tigmaleinu chasadim tovim. Baruch atah Adonai v'melech chasadim tovim l'amo Yisrael. You may be seated as we continue on page 12. Hirad Samafanech Adonai Elohai v'lo avotai shetatzileinu hayom. Lefichach anachnu chayavim lehodot lecha l'shabecha l'farecha l'varecha u'lekadesh v'lateit shevach v'hodaya lishmecha. Ashreinu matov v'keinu manayim goraleinu ma'yafa yerushateinu. Ashreinu shanachnu mashkimim u'marivim erev v'voker v'omrim pamayim b'chol yom Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Atahu ad shelo nivra olam atahu mish nivra olam atahu ba'olam hazeh v'atahu la'olam haba. Kadesh shimcha makishei shemecha v'kadesh shimcha b'olamecha u'vishuatcha tarim v'tagbia karneinu baruch atah Adonai mekadesh shimcha barabim. We continue on page 50. Page 50. Mizmor Shir, Chanukah L'Bayit David. Page 52, 3 lines from the top of the page. Elecha Adonai ekra ve'el Adonai etchanan. Elecha Adonai ekra ve'el Shema Adonai v'choneini Adonai ozer li Shema Adonai v'choneini Adonai ozer li Lemani Zamecha Chavod U'Leidom Adonai Elohai Le'olam Odeka. We rise for Baruch She'amar, page 54. Baruch She'amar V'haya Olam Baruch Hu Baruch Oseh V'Reishit Baruch Omer V'Yoseh Baruch Ozer M'chayim Yachid Chei Olamim Melech Mishubach Mfuar Adei Ad Shemo Agadol Baruch Atah Adonai Melech Mehulal Batishbachot. We continue on page 72. We remain standing for Psalm 136, Hallel Hagadol. Hodu l'Adonai ki tov ki le'olam chasto. Hodu le'Elohei ha'Elohim ki le'olam chasto. Hodu l'Adonai ha'Adonim ki le'olam chasto. Le'oseh niflaot gedolot levado ki le'olam chasto. Le'oseh hashamayim b'tbuna ki le'olam chasto. Le'roka haaretz al hamayim ki le'olam chasto. Le'oseh orim gedolim ki le'olam chasto. Et hashemesh memshelet bayom ki le'olam chasto. Et yereach Noten lechem l'chol basar, ki le'olam chasto. Hodu le'el hashamayim, ki le'olam chasto. You may be seated as we continue on page 80. Ashrei yoshvei veitzecha, od yalucha selah. פותח את ידיך, מצביע כל חי רצון. צדיק עיני בכל דרכיו, וחסיד בכל מצב, קרוב עיני בכל... תהילת אדוני ידבר פי, לברך כל בשר שם קודשו לעולם ועד. ואנחנו נברך יה, מעתה ועד עולם, הללויה. Page 88. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, el bekodsho. Hallelujah, b'kiyauzo. Hallelujah, b'gvurotav. Hallelujah, kerov gudo. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah. Hallelujah, betof u'macho. Hallelujah, beteka shofar. Hallelujah, benevel v'chinor. Hallelu betof umachol, Hallelu beminim ve'ugab, Hallelu betziltzalei shama, Hallelu betziltzalei trua, Hallelu, 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 Hallelujah, Hallelu. Kol hanshama tehallelujah, Hallelujah, Hallelujah. Kol hanshama tehallelujah, Hallelujah, Hallelujah. Shabbat shalom. Dan, if you would be so good as to grab the Iyun Tefillah sheets in the back and pass them out. As I mentioned at the beginning of the service, this morning's creative modality for warm-up for prayer, it should be a 2-sheet packet. I'm not sure if they stapled them or not. Today's modality for warming up for prayer is a little bit of study, Iyun Tefillah, a study of the service itself, because through studying the service we can then, on subsequent weeks that we say these prayers, we can connect more deeply to them. So this morning's Iyun Tefillah, this morning's study, is this section that we're about to pray on page 90 of our Siddur. And it is 3 songs of praise in succession. The first one is drawn from the book of Chronicles and is a blessing uttered by David. The second is from the book of Nehemiah. And the third is, of course, Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea. The reason why we are focused on this particular passage today is because the passage from Nehemiah, which is on the middle of page 90, and also is source 1 on the source sheet, describes God changing Abram's name to Abraham, which is a reference, of course, to this week's Torah portion. So since every morning, when we say these words in Psukei de Zimra in our warm-up for prayer, we reference this Shabbos' Torah portion of Lech Lecha, I thought it was fitting to be really thinking deeply about this passage this week. Now, I've created this source sheet as a way for you to follow along with me as I teach about this text, and to bring you in with me on some learning that I did this week to try to understand why we say this and what's and why it was added to our Siddur. So first, let's read the passage from Nehemiah, which is source number 1 and can also be found on page 91 or 90 of our prayer book. You alone are the Lord. You made the heavens, the highest heavens, and all their host, the earth and everything upon it, the seas and everything in them. You keep them all alive, and the host of heaven prostrate themselves before you. You are the Lord God, who chose Abram. You brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and changed his name to Abraham, finding his heart true to you. You made a covenant with him to give the land of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Jebusite, and the Girgashite, to give it to his descendants. And you kept your word, for you are righteous. You took note of our ancestors' affliction in Egypt and heard their cry at the Sea of Reeds. You performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh, all his servants, and all the people of his land, for you knew that they acted presumptuously toward them. You made a name for yourself that endures to this day. You split the sea before them. They passed through the sea on dry land, but you threw their pursuers into the depths like a stone into the raging waters. So if you look at source 2, Reuven Hammer, the great liturgist, describes these 3 songs of praise that have been added to our Psukei de Zimra. Right? Psukei de Zimra literally means verses of song, and originally they were just psalms. The earliest Psukei de Zimra was just say these psalms. And the first set of psalms is the set of psalms that's immediately preceding the end of the book of Psalms, the last 5 or so psalms, from 145, which is our Ashrei, to 150, which is the final psalm. That's what we say every morning. And then they also added some additional psalms for Shabbat that came before Psalm 145. By the time we got our Siddur, there were also these 3 other songs that weren't from the book of Psalms that were added in. And Reuben Hammer says, these songs all have this theme of praising God, and they have been artfully arranged so that one leads into the other. We begin with the praise of God in David's last address, as he spoke to those who contributed toward the future building of the temple. That's on the top of page 90 and 91, the part that we read, Baruch Adonai leolam amen v'amen, right? And Vayevarech David et Adonai le'nei kol ha'kahal vayomer David. This is a section that is from Chronicles 29, like 4 verses from Chronicles, and it's David speaking, and David is praising the people who have built the temple, or who will build the temple. We continue with praise and a historical survey from Abraham to the parting of the sea, which was part of the acceptance of the Torah, part of the ceremony of the acceptance of Torah as our binding law, which Ezra and Nehemiah held in Jerusalem, and we actually have the date of that, 444 BCE. And we conclude with the chanting of the song of praise and thanksgiving sung by Israel at the time of its salvation. In Jewish tradition, the Song of the Sea has always been considered the song par excellence that represents the greatest possible praise of God. Its poetry is unrivaled in the Torah. No wonder it eventually took its place daily as the climax of our biblical readings that both voice our appreciation of the works of God in nature and history and helps us to prepare our minds and hearts for the morning worship service itself. So I think what this points to for me in terms of our understanding of why these passages got put into our Psukei de Zimra, into our service, it speaks to the broader themes of Psukei de Zimra itself. The Psalms of Psukei de Zimra have these themes of God acting in nature. But the rabbis also had a theology of God acting in history. And there wasn't enough of that in the Psalms for Psukei de Zimra. So they really wanted, before we entered into prayer itself, with the Baruch and the Matbeya Shel Tfilah, the central part of prayer, they really wanted us to have a cognizance, a consciousness of God's working in history, in addition to God's working in nature. The Psalms of Psukei de Zimra do a great job of talking about God working in nature. But while some Psalms do have a sense of God working in history, a lot of the Psalms in Psukei de Zimra don't. Now, there are some notable exceptions, especially on Shabbat. The additional Psalms that we add in on Shabbat, including the one that we sang today, Hodu l'Adonai ki tov, ki le'olam chasto, that one has a historical approach. And if you consider creation, that is the moment of creation, as part of God acting in history, then some of the Psalms of Psukei de Zimra also have that. But ending with these historical aspects of God acting in history, lifts up that theme of rabbinic theology and centralizes it. Now, sometimes Judaism is described as a religion that's more about practice than about faith, more about what you do than about what you think. And that isn't untrue, okay? But it is only partially true, at least according to this rabbi, which is to say, I think our Siddur is a compendium of a multivocal approach to Jewish theology. It's not one idea about what to think, but there are clues in the Siddur about what gets left in and what gets left out, and how the words are changed, and how it's connected to the biblical text before, that gives us clues about what the rabbis hoped that our aspirational theology or theologies might be. And so thinking about these historical passages, these songs of praise that specifically talk about sort of God's acting in history, and this one from Nehemiah, which mentions our Torah portion, or references our Torah portion, this passage is a whole history of God acting in history. And I think they are put in here to get us to be thinking about this kind of theological or historical consciousness. Part of what it means to prepare for prayer is to think about our relationship to God as a people throughout history. So now that we've talked about some of the sort of broader aspects of this, I guess I want to pause for a moment to ask if there are any questions or thoughts or comments. And then we're going to actually look at the passage itself in detail and sort of do some analysis of the passage from Nehemiah itself. So any questions or thoughts? Okay, so we turn now to page 3. To source 3. So again, this is Rabbi Reuven Hammer, and specifically commenting on this idea that God changed Abram's name to Abraham, okay, which is mentioned in our passage from Nehemiah. It's so important to Nehemiah that in the list of ways in which God intervened in history, right, which is what this is, right, Nehemiah is sharing sort of a version of Jewish history. Now, we have several, by the way, versions of sort of 4-sentence summaries of Jewish history. We read one of them. One of them comes from the book of Deuteronomy, and we read it in our Passover Haggadah every year, right? There's one in the book of Joshua also. But here, the one in the book of Nehemiah, right? So important to Nehemiah is this moment where God changed Abram's name to Abraham that it makes the list. Now, the one in the Haggadah, that one says, our father was a wandering Aramean who sojourned and went down to Egypt, and there he became a great nation, mighty and numerous, and God took us out of Egypt with an outstretched hand, right? So we know that passage. That passage doesn't mention Abram getting his name changed to Abraham. It's fascinating to me that that is such a crucial moment in Jewish history, according to Nehemiah's understanding of history. So why, when I was trying to prepare for this teaching, that was one of my big questions. Why this detail? And of course, it comes from this week's Torah portion. So Reuven Hammer says, when Abram was 99 years old, God established a covenant with him, promising him that he would be the father of many nations and that his offspring would inherit the land of Canaan. The letter He, a letter from the divine name, was then added to the names of Abram and Sarai, who became Abraham and Sarah. Okay, and then it says, see this week's Torah portion, Genesis 17, 1-6, the very end of our Torah portion. So, great, but it doesn't really get to the answer that I'm seeking, which is why is this so important that Nehemiah wants to include it in a historical approach. So we look for deeper analysis, and we found Abraham Isaac Cook also comments on this. So Abraham Isaac Cook says, this is the import of God's directive to change Abram, which signifies leadership of the single nation, to which signifies the leadership of the single nation of Aram to Abraham, the father of a multitude of nations. Now, the source that I took this from, which is the Sidur Lev Shalem, which we're going to be purchasing for the congregation and which we're going to transition to be using, one brought this selection from Abraham Isaac Cook, but wanted to make sure that you understood what was going on here. So there's a little explanation in italics. According to the Babylonian Talmud, Abraham's name was changed because in the beginning he was a leader of Aram, That is to say, his name was Avram, the father of Aram. And at the end, he was the leader of a whole world. Avraham is Av-Hamon, father of multitudes. The ancient rabbis taught that except when directly quoting scripture, it is expressly forbidden to refer to Abraham by his former name. And in fact, the Torah itself does a very good job of only referring to Abraham as Abraham after his name is changed. Unlike, by the way, Jacob, whose name was changed to Yisrael, but goes back and forth. That's an aside. We can talk about that in some later week. But Abraham, once his name is changed, it stays Abraham, right? Which is how much the more interesting that Nehemiah here mentions Abram's former name, right? You picked Abram and changed his name to Abraham. Obviously, if that's the sentence you want to say, you have to mention his former name. But it's one of the only places in the whole Tanakh where after Abraham's name was changed, that fact of the name change is mentioned. So God was saying to Abraham, I have raised you beyond this norm of nationalism, which is but a convention and not true justice. Your heart should not be devoted exclusively to the benefit of Aram, one nation, but rather to seek the peace of all of God's creations. Seek out the well-being of all. Thus, one who calls Abraham Abram transgresses. By doing so, one causes Israel to regress to a state of nationalism, which is no more than a collective form of egoism, and therefore a transgression. So, we talked a little bit about the theology that is going into putting this passage in our Psukei de Zimra service. I think Rav Abraham Isaac Cook is really taking that a next level, right? Here is this theology of sort of right at the beginning of our prayer service, as we're warming up for prayer, we want to be reminded that our mission, that Abraham's mission as a Jewish people, right, was not to be focused on just one nation. We can't just be about Jewish people. We have to be about the peace of all the nations. Now, Abraham Isaac Cook was, in some ways, the father of religious Zionism. So it's sort of fascinating that his Zionism is also influenced so strongly by this anti-nationalist trend. And that he feels that it's so important, right? That Nehemiah feels that it's so important, right? And we have to understand, Nehemiah is doing a project of nation building, right? What Nehemiah is doing by telling this story of the Jewish people in this way, right, is about revitalizing the Jewish nation after the return from the exile. Think about what Reuven Hammer said about this passage from Nehemiah, that this was part of the ceremony of acceptance of the Torah as our binding law. Part of the ceremony of accepting the Torah as our binding law. So within Nehemiah's idea of sort of religious reification, Nehemiah adds in this passage about God changing Abram's name, and Rav Abraham Isaac Cook says the reason why that's included is so that we wouldn't be stuck in one nation nationalism. Wow. I mean, that's a totally radical way of reading this passage, I think. So, we're going to pause there, this question of why are we entering into that detail, and we're going to do one more sort of thought here, which is what else can we learn about sort of Nehemiah's theology or our theology or the theology of the prayer book. So in Sidur Lev Shalem, we learn, the commentary says, on the words, you Adonai alone, which is the first phrase of this passage from Nehemiah, you alone are Adonai, atahu Adonai levadecha. This prayer was recited in Second Temple in the Second Temple, when the people returning from exile rededicated themselves under the guidance of Ezra and Nehemiah. With its recitation, each morning's prayer is an act of rededication. Again, a beautiful way of thinking about it, right? We, the Jewish people, read this passage every morning in order to rededicate ourselves daily to this process of being a people. Okay, and I gave you some of the passages from that were mentioned above. So Mark Brettler says about "You alone are Adonai," Nehemiah, which was recited after Sukkot in the post-exilic community. Although we think of Nehemiah as a peripheral book, it is closer in time to the individual who inserted it into the Siddur, and thus reflects his theology more closely than many of the earlier classical sections of the Bible. So Mark Brettler says, why is this passage inserted into the prayer book? Right? We got from Reuven Hammer this idea, they were artfully constructed to flow into each other. That's very nice. But why do we say it every day? Brettler says, well, because Nehemiah, being a later book of the Tanakh, more closely connected to the theology of the authors of the Siddur than did earlier sections of the Tanakh. We might be more familiar with the Torah, right? With the 5 books of Moses. But for the authors of the Siddur, Nehemiah's words represent more closely their theology than maybe the 5 books of Moses do. So, for example, right, it introduces the next prayers nicely. Sure, from here to the end of the Song of the Sea, we get a balance to the Psalms by emphasizing not just God's general greatness and His creative majesty, but the salvation of Israel specifically. The idea of God, here, this is the part that I thought was really interesting. The idea of God as the sole God, whom all must worship, becomes particularly predominant in the late biblical texts, such as this one in Nehemiah. Atahu Adonai levadecha, you are the only God, is not actually a theological approach of the earlier texts of the Torah. And in fact, the Song of the Sea very clearly says that God is stronger than all the other gods. So by putting it here right before the introduction to the Song of the Sea, it tempers the theology contained in the Song of the Sea, right? So by contrast, Deuteronomy 4:19, for instance, mentions astral deities that God gave the other nations to worship. When you look up to the sky and behold the sun, moon, and stars, the whole heavenly host, you must not be lured into bowing down to them or serving them. These the Lord your God allotted to the other peoples. Nevertheless, the heavenly hosts remain as angels of sorts. In contrast to later, especially Maimonidean Judaism, such beings are not understood as interfering with monotheism. In other words, the Torah has no problem saying there are other gods, but we worship God. But by the time Nehemiah was writing, there was voices in Judaism that had a theological problem with that. And by including this in the text of the Torah, in the text of the Siddur, the rabbis are uplifting that theological voice of a new kind of monotheism that's more along the lines of the monotheism that we imagine when we say the word monotheism, influenced as we are by Maimonides. And it does, I think, temper the idea that we're about to read this Song of the Sea, where it says, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, right? Who is like you among the other deities, God, right? Which seems to imply that there are other deities, right? Which, of course, the Song of the Sea is one of our oldest passages in the Torah, and it makes sense that the theology of the Song of the Sea is different from the theology of the authors of the Siddur, from Nehemiah. To me, what this really speaks to, and with this I'll close, because we're getting to the end of our time for our Iyun Tefillah. To me, what this speaks to, again, is something which I often come back to, which is our tradition is multivocal. We're supposed to feel that the tradition doesn't have one idea about things, right? And I started this by talking about how, we think maybe that Judaism doesn't have a theology. It doesn't. It has theologies. And multiple theologies are contained in our sacred texts, including the text of the Siddur. But these passages, which we mumble through at the end of Psukei de Zimra every day, right, actually are deeply connected to this week's Torah portion, to a theological approach about nationalism, to an understanding of God as one, to this idea of sort of God's working in history, sort of uplifting these different themes that are contained throughout Psukei de Zimra. And I think that the more we learn about the different voices in our Siddur, the more meaningful our prayers can be. So, with that, let's rise, page 90, and we'll close Psukei de Zimra with these words about the Song of the Sea. Vayivarech David et Adonai, l'nei kol ha'kahal vayomer David. Ata Adonai Elohim asher bacharta be'Avram, ve'otzeito me'or kasdim, v'samta shemo Avraham, u'matata tevavo ne'eman lefanecha, v'charot imo habrit. V'hayam bakata lifneihem, v'yaru b'toch hayam b'yabasha, v'rotfem yishlachta b'mtzolot, k'mo evem b'mayim azim, v'yosher na b'yom hahu, et Yisrael mi'am Mitzrayim. V'yar Yisrael tiyad Adonai, asher asa Adonai b'Mitzrayim, v'yiru am et Adonai, v'yaminim Adonai, v'Moshe avdo, az yashir Moshe, u'v'nei Yisrael yishir azot l'Adonai v'm'leimu. Ki Adonai hamlucha, Moshe b'goyim, al Moshe bar Tzion nishpot l'Arisa, v'aytal Adonai hamlucha, v'haya Adonai l'melech al kol haaretz, v'yom hahu Adonai echad, u'shemo echad. You may be seated, page 334. Nishmat kol chai, tivarech et shimcha Adonai Eloheinu. Ne'alel chana shebecha nefarecha nevarech et shem kodshecha kamor, David bachi nafshi et Adonai, v'chol kravai et shem kodsho. Hayel b'tatzimo duzecha, gadol b'chvod shemecha, hagimor lanetzach v'hanora b'norotecha, hamelech hayoshem, al kisei ram v'nisa. The formal chanting of Shachrit begins at the bottom of page 336 with the words, Shochein Ad. Alexandra will be leading us in Shachrit.
Shochein Ad Maharam v'kadosh shemo, v'chatuv rananu tzadikim b'Adonai, la yesharim nava tehila, b'fi yesharim tithalal, u'v'dihrei tzadikim titbarach, ובלשון חסידים תתרומם, ובקרב קדושים תתקדש, ובמקהלות רבבות עמך בית ישראל. ישתבח שמך לעד מלכנו, האל המלך הגדול והקדוש בשמיים ובארץ, כי לך נאה אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו. שירו שבחה, הלל וזמרה, עוז וממשלה, נצח גדולה וגבורה, תהילה ותפארת, קדושה ומלכות, ברכות והודאות מעתה ועד עולם. ברוך אתה אדוני, אל מלך גדול ותשבחות, אל ההודעות אדון הנפלאות, הבוחר בשירי זמרה, מלך אלוהי העולמים.
Chatzi Kaddish, page 338.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה.
Amen.
בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי. בחיי חול וביומי חול ובחיי דכל בית ישראל. בהגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם עולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרום ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשא בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה תמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. ברכו את אדוני המבורך.
Baruch Adonai HaMorach Le'olam Va'ed.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, יוצר אור ובורא חושך, עושה שלום ובורא את הכל.
You may be seated as we continue on the bottom of page 340.
אין כרכך אדוני אלוהינו בעולם הזה, ואין זולתך מלכנו לחיי העולם הבא. אפס בלתך גואלנו למות המשיח, ואין דומה לך מושיענו לתחיית המתים. אל אדון על כל המעשים, ברוך ומבורך בפי כל נשמה, גודלו וטובו מלא עולם דעת ותבונה סובבים אותו, המתגאה על חיות הקודש ונהדר בכבוד על המרכבה שלוחות ומישור לפני כיסו, חסד ורחמים לפני כבודו. טובים מאורות שברא אלוהינו יצרם בדעת בבינה ובהשכל, כוח וגבורה נתן בהם להיות מושלים בקרב תבל, מלאים זיו ומפיקים נוגה, נעזיבם בכל העולם, שמחים בסתם וששים בבואם, עושים בהם הרצון כהונם. פאר וכבוד נותנים לשמו, צהלה ורינה לזכר מלכותו. קרא לשמש ויזרח אור, ראה והתקין צורת הלבנה. שבח נותנים לו כל צבא מרום, תפארת וגדולה, שרפים ויופנים וחיות הקודש. לאל אשר שבח ומעשים ביום השביעי. תתברך מושיענו על שבח מעשה ידיך, ועל מאורי אור שעשית יפארו חסלה. תתברך צורנו מלכנו וגואלנו בורא קדושים. Page 344. וכולם פותחים את פיהם בקדושה וטהרה, בשירה ובזמרה, ומברכים ומשבחים ומפארים, ומפאריצים ומקדישים וממליכים את שם האל, המלך הגדול, הגיבור והנורא, קדוש הוא. וכולם מקבלים עליהם עול מלכות שמיים זה מזה, ונותנים רשות זה לזה, להקדיש ליוצרם בנחת רוח, בשפה ברורה ונימה קדושה, כולם כאחד עונים ואומרים ביראה, קדוש, 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 אדוני צבאות, מלוא כל הארץ כבודו. והאופנים וחיות הקודש, ברעש גדול מתנסים ומצורפים, לעומתם משבחים ואומרים, ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו. אור חדש על ציון תאיר, 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 ונזכה כולנו מהרה לאורו, ונזכה כולנו מהרה לאורו. ברוך אתה אדוני יוצר המאורות. Page 346. אהבה רבה אהבתנו, אדוני אלוהינו, חמלה גדולה ויתרה חמלת עלינו. אבינו מלכנו, בעבור אבותינו, שבטחו בך, אבינו מלכנו. ותלמדם חוקי חיים, כן תכוננו תלמדנו, אבינו אהב הרחמן, המרחם רחם עלינו. ותן בליבנו להבין ולהשכיל לשמוע, ללמוד וללמד, לשמור ולעשות, ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה. והאר עינינו בתורתך, ודבק ליבנו במצוותיך, ויחד לבבינו לאהבה וליראה את שמך, ולא נבוש לעולם ועד, ולא נבוש לעולם ועד, כי בשם קודשך הגדול והנורא בטחנו, נגילה ונשמחה בישועתך. והביאנו לשלום מארבע כנפות הארץ, ותוליכנו קוממיות לארצנו, כי אל פועל ישועות אתה, ובנו בחרת מכל עם ולשון, וקרבתנו לשמך הגדול, סלע באמת, להודות לך ולייחדך באהבה. ברוך אתה אדוני, הבוחר בעמו ישראל באהבה. שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבבך, ושיננתם לבניך, ודיברת בם, בשבתך בביתך, ובלכתך בדרך, ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם להיות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. אדוני אלוהיכם אמת, אמת ויציב ונכון וקיים. לדור ודור הוא קיים ושמו קיים, וכיסו נכון ומלכותו ואמונתו לעד קיימת, ודבריו חיים וקיימים נאמנים ונכבדים. אמת שאתה הוא אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, מלכנו מלך אבותינו גואלנו גואל אבותינו, יוצרנו צור ישועתנו, פודנו ומצילנו מעולם שמך, אין אלוהים זולתך. עזרת אבותינו אתה הוא מעולם, מוגים בשביליהם אחריהם פחות ועובד. תהילות לאל עליון ברוך ומבורך, משה ובני ישראל לכנו שירה בשמחה רבה ויאמרו כולם. מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נדר בקודש, נורא תהילות אוסף אלה. שירה חדשה שיבחו גאולים לשמך על שפת הים, יחד כולם הודו והמליכו ואמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד.
We rise for Tzur Yisrael, page 352, followed by the Amidah for Shabbat morning, which begins on page 354.
צור ישראל, קומה בעזרת ישראל, ופתחי נאומך, יהודה וישראל, גואלנו, אדוני צבאות שמו, קדוש ישראל, ברוך אתה אדוני, קהל ישראל. ברוך אתה אדוני, אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, אלוהי אברהם, אלוהי יצחק ואלוהי יעקב, אלוהי שרה, אלוהי רבקה, אלוהי רחל ואלוהי לאה, האל הגדול, הגיבור והנורא, אל עליון, גומל חסדים טובים וקונה הכל, וזוכר חסדי אבות, ומביא גואל לבני בניהם, למען שמו ביהבה. מלך עוזר ופוקד ומושיע ומגן, ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם ופוקד שרה. אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי מתים אתה רב להושיע, משיב הרוח ומוריד הגשם, מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיי מתים ברחמים רבים, סומך נופלים ורופא חולים, ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר, מי כמוך בעל גבורות, ומי דומה לך, מלך ממית ומחיה, ומצמיח ישועה, ונאמן אתה לחיות מתים, ברוך אתה אדוני, מחיי המתים.
נקדש את שמך בעולם, כשם שמך
נקדש את שמך בעולם, כשם שמקדישים אותו בשמי מרום, ככתוב על יד נביאך, וקרא זה אל זה ויאמר, קדוש, 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 אדוני צבאות, מלוא כל הארץ כבודו. אז בקול רעש גדול, אדיר וחזק משמיעים כה, מתנסים לעומת צרפים, לעומתם ברוך יאמרו, ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו, ממקומך מלכנו תופיע, ותמלוך עלינו, כי מחכים אנחנו לך. מתי תמלוך, תמלוך בציון, בקרוב בימינו. לעולם ועד, לעולם ועד, תשכון, תתגדל ותתקדש, בתוך ירושלים עירך, לדור ודור ולנצח, נצח נצחים, לי לי לי, ועינינו תראנה מלכותך. כדבר האמור בשירי עוזך, על ידי דוד משיח צדקך. ימלוך אדוני לעולם, אלוהיך ציון, לדור ודור, הללויה. לדור ודור, לדור ודור, לדור ודור נגיד גודלך, לדור ודור, לדור ודור, לדור ודור נגיד גודלך, ולנצח נצחים, ולנצח נצחים, קדושתך נקדיש. בשבחך אלוהינו מפינו שלא ימות, לא ימוש לעולם ועד. כי המלך גדול וקדוש אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני, האל הקדוש.
If you haven't completed your individual whispered Amidah, please continue davening. We join together for Kaddish Shalem, page 392.
יתגדל ויקדש שמי רבה.
אמן.
ויעמד דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי בחיי חון וביומי וחיי דכל בית ישראל. בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך. לעולם לעולם היה. יתברך. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, תאמירן בימה ואמרו אמן. תתקבל צורת הון ובעוד הון דכל ישראל, קודם ובהון די ושמיא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו Amen.
We turn back to the Psalm for Shabbat, page 32.
היום יום שבת קודש, שבו היו הלווים אומרים בבית המקדש, מזמור שיר ליום השבת. טוב להודות לאדוני, לזמר שמך. עוד ינובון בשיבה, דשנים ורעננים יהיו, להגיד כי ישר אדוני, צורי ולא עוולת בו.
Kaddish Avelim, Mourner's Kaddish, page 52. Yitgadal, V'yitkadash, Shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Ve'alma divra kirutei, v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, v'agala uvizman kariv v'imru. Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabbah mevarach le'alam elamei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitale v'yitalal Shmei dekudesha b'richu. Leila min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran be'alma v'imru. Amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom mimromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Yasher koach to Alexandra for leading us in Shachrit. Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to Congregation Agudat Achim's in-person and live stream Shabbat morning service. I'm Rabbi Rafi Spitzer. If you were here at the beginning of the service, you got to have the opportunity to explore entering into prayer through the modality of iyun tefillah, of a deep dive into one of our prayers. We looked at the passage from Nehemiah. That's one of our closing hymns of Psukei de Zimra. The passage from Nehemiah describes God changing Abram's name to Abraham, which is, of course, a reference to this week's Torah portion, Parashat Lech Lecha, which we are about to read together. If you are interested in preparing for prayer through various spiritual modalities, through song, through poetry, through English readings, through movement, through meditation, through study, I encourage you to come at 9:15 and experience those, and also to let me know what you're interested in. Perhaps I can work with you and have you be somebody who can present for those 25 minutes at the beginning of service. Certainly, it doesn't always have to be me, and when the ritual committee suggested this idea, they hoped that various members of the community would be interested in helping everybody else to prepare for our worship in that way. As we have been doing in our pandemic times, our Torah service continues to begin with the lifting of the Torah with Hagbah, which is actually a Sephardi custom drawn from the Jewish communities of Morocco and Spain and the Edot HaMizrach, the eastern lands. This tradition of showing the Torah at the beginning of the Torah service works for us because our honorees who ascend to receive their honor, their aliyah, only ascend to the stender at the base of the bima and not all the way up onto the bima. And doing the Hagbah at the beginning allows everybody who has been so honored to have a visual recognition of the text of the Torah that they can be thinking about when they say the blessings over reading the Torah when it's their turn. That's why we have adopted the Sephardi practice for the time being in our congregation, and a reminder that our COVID task force is always thinking about and revising and being careful about how we as a community are able to gather safely indoors and able to celebrate Shabbat in a way which limits the spread or the potential spread of COVID. And that's why we appreciate and value everybody's commitment to remaining masked and to following the rules as laid out by our committee. Alexander is going to lead us in the service for taking the Torah out of the ark, which can be found in our Siddur on page 394.
Ein kamocha v'Elohim Adonai ve'ein k'maasecha malchutecha malchut kol ha'olamim u'memshaltecha bechol dor v'dor Adonai melech Adonai malach Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed Adonai hoz le'amo yitein Adonai yevarech et amo v'shalom Av ha'rachamim heitiv avirtzoncha et Zion Tivnei chomot Yerushalayim Tivnei chomot Yerushalayim Ki hevecha levad batachnu melech eram v'nisa Adon olamim.
We rise as the ark is opened.
Vayhi binso Aharon vayomer Moshe Kuma Adonai veyafutzu oivecha veyanusu misanecha mipanecha ki mision tetzei Torah ki mision Torah udvar Adonai mi Yerushalayim Baruch shenatan Torah Torah Baruch shenatan Torah Torah le'amo Israel B'kedushato Berich Shmei Demarei Alma Bei hanarachetz Velishmei Kadisha Kadisha Yakira Anahem Hartush Bechan Yehi Rahava קודמך, דתפתח ליבי באורייתא, ותשלים משאלין דליבי, וליבה דכל עמך ישראל, לטוב ולחיים ולשלום. אמן. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.
Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo.
Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo.
Gadol Adonai iti, uneroma Shemo yachdav. Lecha Adonai, הגדולה והגבורה והתפארת והנצח וההוד, כי רוב
בשמיים ובארץ, לך אדוני הממלכה והמנצח לכל ראש.
רוממו, 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 אדוני אלוהינו, והשתחוו, והשתחוו, לאדום רגליו קדוש הוא. רוממו, רוממו, אדוני אלוהינו, והשתחוו, והשתחוו, להר קודשו כי קדוש, אדוני אלוהינו.
We remain standing as the Torah is lifted.
וזאת התורה אשר שם משה לפני בני ישראל, על פי אדוני ביד משה.
This morning we are reading from Parashat Lech Lecha. You may be seated. We pick up our reading at chapter 16, verse 1, which can be found on page 86. What we've missed since the end of last week's Parsha is God picks Abraham seemingly out of the blue. His name, of course, at that time is Abram. The Torah gives us no explanation for why Abraham. We do have a lot of stories from the Midrash that try to answer that question. Then Abraham goes on a journey. He gets to the land of Canaan and immediately has to leave to go to Egypt, which prefigures, of course, the Exodus. The descendants of Abraham also have to go down to Egypt and then come back up from Egypt with great wealth. And in fact, the language that talks about Abraham coming back up from Egypt with great wealth is the same kind of language. So it prefigures the Exodus. Then we have the story of Abraham and Lot separating. We have Lot getting captured by the 5 kings in the north. Abraham joins forces with the 4 kings nearby and goes and recaptures Lot and all the stuff. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Then in chapter 15, God gives an unconditional covenant to Abraham and Abraham's descendants, an everlasting unconditional covenant which is unlike the covenant that we imagine at Sinai or in Deuteronomy, which is conditional, of course, on the Jewish people's performance of mitzvot. The covenant that God makes with the descendants of Abraham and his descendants, is a completely unconditional covenant. And that brings us finally to chapter 16, where we pick up Sarai, as we found out at the end of last week's Torah portion, is barren. She cannot give birth. And we pick up the story with Sarai's creative solution to that problem, which is surrogacy. We know that while this story is not the most comfortable for us in terms of Sarah's actions, we relate nonetheless to the emotional tenor of the story, and especially for those of us who have struggled with infertility, with pregnancy loss, with what it means to desire a child and be unable to have one, or with not wanting to have a child, but with the societal expectations of motherhood. The fact that our stories are so brutal and honest in the way that they deal with the realities of life, even if we don't necessarily agree with the actions of the characters in the stories, I think speaks very much to why this text remains a text that every time we come back to it, we find new things in it. Vayazor v'yagen v'yoshia l'chol ha'chosim bo v'nomar amen hakol havu godel ininu kavod la'Torah yamod. David ben Rina v'Yisrael halevi Baruch shenatan Torah l'mo Yisrael b'kedushato v'atem advekim b'Adonai Elohechem chaim kulchem hayom.
Baruch et Adonai Hamvarach.
Baruch Adonai Hamvarach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamvarach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai notein ha'Torah.
Amen. V'sarai eshet Avram lo yalda lo vela shivcha hamitzrit ushma Hagar. Vatomer Sarai el Avram hine na atzarani Adonai miledet bona el shivchati ulai ibane mimena vayishma Avram lekol Sarai vatikach Sarai eshet Avram et Hagar Avram et Hagar hamitzrit shivchata miketz eser shanim leshevet Avram be'eretz Canaan vatitenota le'Avram isha lo le'isha vayavo el Hagar vatahar vateraki harata vatekaha gvirta beneha vatomer Sarai el Avraham chamasi alecha anochi natati shivchati bechekecha vateraki harata vaeka beneha yishpot Adonai beni uvenecha Vayomer Avraham el Sarai hine shivchatech biyadech asila hatov be'enayik vataneha Sarai vativrach mipaneha.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torat emet v'chayei olam nata betochenu. Baruch atah Adonai notein ha'Torah.
Amen.
Amen. Yamod. Aliyah Shenit.
ברכו את אדוני המבורך.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני, אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים, ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen.
Amen. Vayimtza malach Adonai al ein hamayim bamidbar al ha'ayin b'derech shur. Vayomer hagar shivchat sarai emizevad va'ana telechi va'atomer mipnei sarai gevirti anochi borachat. Vayomer la malach Adonai shuvi el gevirtech vehitani tachat yadeha.
ברוך אתה אדוני, אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר נתן לנו תורה אמת, וחיי לנו אתה בתוכנו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen. Tamot. Shoshana Bad Felvachana. Aliyah Shlishit. The third Aliyah can be found on page 87, verse 10.
Baruch et Adonai HaMevarech.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai HaMevarech L'olam Va'ed. Baruch Adonai HaMevarech L'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim V'natan Lanu Et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Vayomer la malach Adonai harba ha'arbe et zarek velo yisafer merov. Vayomer la malach Adonai hina chara v'yoladet ben v'karahat shemo Yishmael ki shama ha'Adonai el onyech. Vehu yeh pere Adam yado v'kol beyad kobo ve'al pnei kol echav yishkon v'tikra Hashem Adonai hadover eleha ata el roi ki amra hagam halom ra'iti acharei roi. Al ken karaha la be'er lachai roi hine ben kadesh uven bared vateled Hagar le'Avraham ben vayikra Avraham Shem beno asher yalda Hagar Yishmael Ve'Avraham ben shmonihim shana v'shesh shanim v'ledet Hagar et Yishmael le'Avraham.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam natan b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Yamod. Baruch ben Tzvi, Aliyah Arvit. The fourth Aliyah can be found on page 89, chapter 17, verse 1.
Baruch atah Adonai Hamvorach.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach La'om Va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Bachar Banu Michol Hamin ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen.
אמן. ויהי אברהם בן 90 שנה ו9 שנים, וירא אדוני אל אברהם, ויאמר אליו אני אל שדי, התהלך לפני ואהיה תמים, ואתנה בריתי ביני ובינך וארבה אותך במאוד מאוד. ויפול אברהם על פניו, right, of course. ויפול אברהם על פניו, וידבר איתו אלוהים לאמור, אני הנה בריתי איתך והיית לאב המון גויים, ולא יקרא עוד את שמך אברהם, והיה שמך אברהם, כי אף המון גויים נתתיך, והפרעתי אותך במאוד מאוד, ונתתיך לזרע לגויים ומלאכים ממך יצאו.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת, וחיי עולם נטע בתוכנו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen. Shkach. Yamod. Yerachmi al Asher ben Moshe Yehudit Aliyah Chamishit. The fifth Aliyah can be found on page 90, chapter 17, verse 7.
Baruch hu et Adonai HaMorach.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Olam Vaed.
Baruch Adonai HaMorach Olam Vaed. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et torato. Baruch ata Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. V'hakimoti et beriti. Amen. V'hakimoti et beriti beni uvenecha uvein zaracha acharecha l'doratam livrit olam liot la l'chai lihi liot l'cha l'Elohim u'l'zaracha acharecha v'natati l'cha u'l'zaracha acharecha et eretz migurecha et kol eretz Canaan, is that eretz Canaan? La'akuzat olam v'hayiti lachem lelohim vayomer Elohim el Abraham v'ata et briti tishmor ata v'zaracha acharav l'doratam so beriti asher tishmeru beini uveinechem uvein zaracha acharecha himo lachem kol zachar Unamaltem et besar alatchem v'haya le'od berit beni uveinechem uvein shmonat yamim Yimo lachem kol zachar l'dortechem yelid ba'id umiknat kasev mikol ben nekahar asher lo mizarachahu Yimo yelid beitcha umiknat kaspacha v'hayata briti v'hayta briti b'sarchem livrit olam v'arel zachar asher lo yimol et b'sahar alato v'nikrita hanefesh hahiv me'ameha et briti hefahar Vayomer Elohim el Avraham, Sarai ishtaka lo tikra et Shema Sarai, ki Sarah Shema uverakti ota, vegam natati mimena lecha ben, uveraktiha v'haita legoyim alchei amim mimena yihiyu. Vayipol Avraham al panav v'Yitzchak, Vayomer bilibo halvem eyashana yivale v'im Sarah havatishim shana tele.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam natan b'tocheinu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Yamod. Yitzchak ben Chamaleya, Aliyah HaShishit. The sixth Aliyah can be found page 92, verse 18.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach.
Baruch Hanem Baruch Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach. Baruch Adonai Hamvorach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Adonai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
I missed that. This is a little bit confusing.
Amen. Vayomer Avraham el ha-Elohim lo yishme'el yihiyu lefanecha Yihiyeh lefanecha vayomer Elohim aval Sarah ishtaka yoledet lecha ben v'kara et shemo Yitzchak v'hakimoti et beriti ito livrit olam l'zaracha acharav v'lo Yishmael Shematicha hine berakti oto v'hifreti oto v'hirbeti oto bim od ma'od shnei masa nisim yolid unatativ l'goy gadol v'briti Achim et Yitzchak asher telei lecha Sarah lamoed hazeh b'shana ha'arav aheret v'chol l'daber ito v'yahal Elohim me'al Avraham v'yikach Avraham et Yishmael beno ve'et kol yelidei ve'ito ve'et kol miknas kasko kol zakah ba'anshe beit Avraham Vayahama lebesar alatam be'etzem hayom hazeh kasher diber ito Elohim.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam natan b'tocheinu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Yamod. Yaakov ben Moshe v'Bran Azisol. Aliyah Shavi'it. The seventh Aliyah can be found on page 93, verse 24.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach.
Baruch Hanem Baruch Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Avraham ben Tishim v'tesha shanim shana behimolo b'sar alato v'yishmael beno ben shalosh esrei shana behimolo et b'sar alato ve'etzem hayom hazeh nimol Avraham v'yishmael beno V'chol anshe ve'ito yilid bayit umitnat kesef me'et ben nechar nimolu ito.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam natan b'tocheinu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. We rise as the ark is open for the healing prayer. Mishabeirach hi avotenu mekor abracha leimotenu. May the source of strength, who blessed the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Mishabeirach avatina Abraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov Sarah Yivkacha v'Leah Yivrech v'Peit HaCholim Et Lesar v'Ed Mari Travaizo v'Ed Akiva ben Gittel v'Ed Miriam bat Malka v'Ed Shalom ben Chaya v'Ed Bracha bat Myra v'Ed Linda Pearlstein v'Ed Michal bat Tova v'Ed Michael Roberts v'Ed Eric Hurst v'Ed Riva Bela bat Avram Chaim v'Reza v'Ed Yaakov Moshe ben Batim Mindel v'Ed Malka bat Golda v'Ed Fegalea bat Minzasura v'Ed Tamar Chaya bat Ruvain HaKohen v'Ed Asher Yosef ben Fega Malka v'Ed Andrew Parisi Ved Devorah bat Simcha Vedina, Ved Chaim David ben Idol, Ved Masha Pesca bat Chana, Ved Yaakov ben Laura, Ved Yoreh bat Sarah Avraham, Ved Mindel bat Obachaya, Ved Devorah bat Rachel, Ved Tzvia Fega bat Malka v'Mutka, Ved Moshe Natan ben Chana, V'Chaim Yitzchak, Ved Chava Siva bat Marmelka, Ved Haley Rubenstein, V'yed Sarah bat Avram, v'ed Hinda ben Chaim, v'ed Yaakov ben Simcha, v'Mordechai Fivish, v'yed Leah bat Anna v'David, v'yed Sima Bela bat Eliezer, v'ed Paul Dashna, v'yed Dina bat Chaya, v'yed V'et kol ha'cholim b'kilak toshah zot HaKadosh Baruch Hu yimalei rachmim aleim lachzikam l'rapotam v'yishlach lahem meira refuah shema min hashamayim refuat hanefesh refuat haguf v'toch shar cholei Yisrael v'ha'olam mechizek etidei oskim mitzor chayem shabbatim l'zok v'harufah krava lavo hashtabag alav bizman kariv v'nomar amen mi shebeirach imotenu Mekor Abraham Lavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shalema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen. Yitkada v'yitkada shemei rabba ve'alma divrach yirtei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechonu yomechonu v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael v'gala uvizman kariv imeru amen yeshmei rabba mevarach Le'alam l'almei almaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yipar v'yitramam v'yinaseh v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yit'alal Shmei d'kudesha b'richu Le'la min kol birchata v'shirata Tushbechata v'nechemata Damiran me'alma v'yimeru Amen Yamod Dan Moshe ben Chaim Benani Likriyat HaHaftarah. The Maftir Aliyah can be found on page 93, verse 24.
Baruch Hu Adonai Hambarach.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah.
Amen.
Amen. V'Abraham ben Tishim v'tesha shana b'himalo b'sar alataho v'Yishmael beno ben shalosh esrei shana b'himalo et b'sar alataho Be'etzem hayom hazeh nimol Abraham וישמעאל בנו, וכל אנשי ביתו יליד בית ומקנת כסף מאת בן נכר נימולו איתו.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torah emet, v'chayei olam b'tah b'tocheinu, Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Yashkach. As our Gabayim wrap the Torah, we turn now to the Haftarah for Parashat Lech Lecha, which can be found on page 95. The Haftarah comes from the prophet Isaiah chapter 40. For those of you who keep track of this, this Haftarah picks up immediately after the Haftarah of the Shabbat, which immediately succeeds Tisha B'Av. That is, this chapter begins with Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, comfort, O comfort are my people. But in the second half of the chapter, Isaiah is making an argument about the importance of God's covenant with the Jewish people, which, as I mentioned a little bit before, is described in this week's Torah portion as being eternal and unending. It is that tension between these two descriptions of covenant, the covenant which is simply by virtue of being in the community of Abraham, an unending covenant with God, versus the covenant by which we do have to participate, where there are expectations of us. Right? That tension is a productive tension, which is part of Judaism's focus on cycles of exile and return, cycles of closeness and distance from God, from each other, from the Jewish tradition itself. And so it isn't surprising that a chapter which is understood as so deeply comforting would focus on the covenant of Abraham, which is a covenant that is not based on the merits of people, but is based purely on membership in this covenantal community. Page 95, you can follow along as Dan reads the Haftarah.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar b'nviim tovim, v'ratzav v'divreihem hanemorim b'emet. Baruch atah Adonai habocher b'torah u'Moshe avdo, Yisrael amo v'nviei ha'emet v'tzedek. Lama tomar Yaakov v'utadaber Yisrael nistra darki me Adonai u'me Elohai mishpati yavor. Halo yadata im lo shamta Elohei olam Adonai borei ketzot haaretz lo yiyaf velo yiga ein cheker litvunato noten layoev koach ulein onim atzmo yirbeh. Vayafu ne'arim v'yigau v'churim b'kashol yikashelu v'koye Adonai v'yachalifu koach yalu ever kansharim yirutzu v'lo yigau yilchu v'lo yafu. Hacharishu elaim uleumim yachalifu koach yigishu oz yidaberu יחדו למשפט נקרבה. מי העיר ממזרח, צדק יקראהו לרגלו, ייתן לפניו גויים ומלכים ירד, ייתן כעפר חרבו, כקש נידף קשתו. ירדפם יעבור שלום, אורח ברגליו לא יבוא. מפעל ועשה קורא הדורות מראש, אני אדוני ראשון ויד אחרונים אני הוא. ראויים ויראו קצות הארץ יחרדו, קרבו ויעתיון, איש את רעהו יעזורו, ויחיו יאמר חזק. ויחזק חרש את שורף, מחליק פטיש את הולם פעם, אומר לדבק טוב הוא, ויחזקהו במסמרים לא ימות. ואתה ישראל עבדי, יעקב אשר בחרתיך, זרח אברהם אוהבי, אשר החזקתיך מקצות הארץ, ומעט ציליה קראתיך, ויאמר לך עבדי אתה, בחרתיך ולא מאסתיך. אל תירא כי עמך אני, אל תשתא כי אני אלוהיך. אימצתיך אף עזרתיך, אף תמכתיך במין צדקי. הן יבשו יקלמו כל הנחראים בך, יהיו כעין, ויעבדו אנשי ריבך. תבקשם ולא תמצאם, אנשי מצותך, יהי כעין וכאפס, אנשי מלחמתך. כי אני אדוני אלוהיך מחזיק ימינך, ואומר לך אל תירא אני עזרתיך. אל תראי תהולת יעקב מתי ישראל, אני עזרתיך נאום אדוני וגואלך קדוש ישראל. הנה שמתי למרג חרוץ חדש בעל פפיות, תדו שרים ותדו, וגבעות כמות תשים. תזרם ברוח תישאם, ושעורה תפיץ אותם, ואתה תגיל באדוני, בקדוש ישראל תתהלל. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, צור כל העולמים, צדיק בכל הדורות, האל הנאמן אומר ויעשה, מדבר מקיים, שכל דבריו אמת וצדק. נאמן אתה הוא אדוני אלוהינו, ונאמנים דבריך, ודבר אחד מדבריך, הוא לא ישוב ריקם. כי אל מלך נאמן ורחמן אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני, האל הנאמן בכל דבריו. Rachem al Zion ki hivet chayenu, v'alu vat nefesh toshia b'meira b'yameinu, Baruch atah Adonai, Sameach Zion b'vaneha. Samcheinu Adonai Eloheinu b'Eliyahu hanavi avdecha, v'malchut Beit David Mashichecha, b'meira yavo v'yagel libenu, al kiso lo yeshev zor, v'lo yinchalu od achirim et kavodo, כי בשם קדשך נשבעת לו, שלא יבן נרו לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן דוד.
אמן.
על התורה ועל העבודה ועל הנביאים ועל יום השבת הזה, שנתת לנו אדוני אלוהינו לקדושה ולמנוחה, לכבוד ולתפארת. על הכל אדוני אלוהינו אנחנו מודים לך, בורכים אותה, יתברך שמך בפיך חי תמיד לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש השבת.
Amen. Shkach. We continue with the blessings we seek, which can be found in some of the prayer books.
If you have it in the back page inside the cover of your prayer book, please join me vocally. If you do not have it, please join me spiritually. Source of blessing, our guardian of hope, bless, we pray, all who are dear to us. Watch over them with your protecting love. Bless the people of this congregation. Grant them health of body, serenity of spirit, and guide them on the path of Torah and good deeds. Bless our country, our leaders, our fellow citizens. Keep us faithful to our heritage of freedom and justice. Help us banish all suffering and strife. Bless our sisters and brothers in the land of Israel. Prosper the work of their hands and minds, strengthen them, and grant them peace. Bless our fellow Jews wherever they may dwell. Comfort those who are in stress. Deliver them speedily from darkness to light. Bless all your children in every land and community. Unite them in understanding and mutual happiness. Hasten the day when all can rejoice in a world of peace. Amen.
Amen. We continue with Ashrei, page 420. I think there were a few people who were asked to lead Ashrei. Anybody who was is welcome to come up. Page 420.
Taylor Lidabid Aramim Hahai Hamelever Hashim Halela Ba'ed Gadol Adonai Vla Meyod Velig Dilotoin Heker Hadar Kivo Hodeha V'divrei Nifloteha Asiha Zecher Rabtu Chayabiu V'tzita Chayiranenu Tov Adonai Lacho V'rahamav Lacho Ma'asav Kevod Malchut Hayomeru Dvurot Hayadaberu Malchut HaMalchut Kol Amimu Menshetaha Bechol Dor Vador Eine Kol Alecha Yisaberu Vedatana Tetahem Metakwan Bieto Sadik Adonai Bechol Devaha V'zid Bechol Ma'asav רצון יראה ויעשה ואין שנתן נשמע וירשיין. תהילת אדוני אדר בפה יקרב קודשו שיקו של אליו ויד ואנחנו את ברתיה ויעצב לעד עולם הללויה.
We continue with the service for returning the Torah to the Ark, page 422 at the bottom.
Hallelujah, Shem Adonai, ki nizgav Shemo levado.
Odo al-eretz v'shamayim Vayarem keren leyamo Teila lecho hafidav Livnei Yisrael am karovo Hallelujah, hallelujah. Havu Adonai kavod vos. Havu Adonai kavod shemo. Yishachavu Adonai b'hadmat kodesh. Adonai l'mavu yashava yeshiv Adonai melech l'olam ha'me'os ha'amonim. Shabbat Shalom. You may be seated. In chapter 14, Abraham goes and fights the battle of the 4 kings against the 5 kings. Abraham comes back from that war, having freed his nephew Lot with all of the plunder, the booty that the 5 kings had stolen from the 4 kings. And he's about to get back to Sodom with all of this stuff. And right then, he has an encounter that is unexpected. A king who was completely uninvolved in this whole contest, who happens to be the priest of El Elyon, a king who is also a God priest. His name is Malki Tzedek, the king of justice. And where does he live? He lives in Yerushalayim, in Shalem, the city of completion and God's peace. He has an encounter with Abraham, and he brings Abraham bread and wine and blesses Abraham. And chapter 14, verse 18 reads, "And Melchizedek, the king of Shalem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the God Most High. And he blessed him, and said, "Blessed be Abram of the God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed be the God Most High, who hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand." And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So we find here the first time in the Torah that there is a ma'aser, a tithe, a tenth part of income gained given to God, given to community institutions, given to those who need it more than Abraham needs. Melchizedek, the king of justice, and tzedek, justice, righteousness, we also have as the word for tzedakah, which is often translated as charity, but is much more rightly translated as righteous giving, tzedakah. So this morning I over-prepared sources about tzedakah, which I'm not going to share all with you, although I hope at a different time to share some of them. I'm just going to pick a couple and urge you to be thinking about tzedakah as we begin this new Jewish calendar year and as we go into the end of our secular calendar year, and to think about in what ways you and your family give tzedakah, in what ways you talk about it with your children, both children who live in your house and adult children who might not live in your house. How do we engage with our practice of righteous giving, and what does it mean to give a tenth? What is ma'aser really? Nigel Savage wrote, "I have a friend who tithes a portion of her income each year, and she explicitly uses this language, tithing, to make it clear to herself and her family that she is fulfilling her contemporary understanding of the biblical obligation and not simply giving charity. It is a response to an obligation. It's not whether she feels like it or is moved to do so, but it is part of her regular practice. She's quite clear that not everything that the state says is tax deductible counts to her as a tithe, and there are some sorts of tithing that are not tax deductible. So you give $10 to a person who asks for it on the street. That is a tithe that is not a tax deductible donation. I think that Nigel Savage, who until recently was the director of the Hazon Institute, or I'm not sure exactly the institution called Hazon, Jewish response to environmental issues, right? Nigel Savage is speaking about the importance of thinking about these issues in contemporary terms, about having some way of doing it in practice. One thing that I've seen some people do is to have a certain amount of your paycheck, you have direct deposit, you can have direct deposit to two separate bank accounts. So you can have 95% of your paycheck go into your checking account and have 5% go into a special account that is a tzedakah account. And then you just know that when you give tzedakah, you can give from that account, and you don't have to, it's already given in your mind. It's already apportioned to tzedakah. It doesn't feel like it's coming out of your regular budget. The Shulchan Aruch says, the Shulchan Aruch is a code of Jewish law, 16th century, says every person is required to give tzedakah, even the poor who are supported from tzedakah are required to give from that which is given. Right? Even the tzedakah that you're given from the communal pot is considered income and therefore should be tithed. One who gives less than they should, says the Shulchan Aruch, would be compelled by the authorities and whipped until they gave what was estimated as their means. Certainly, The Shulchan Aruch imagines a Jewish communal institutions that have a lot more power than our Jewish communal institutions do. I do not think that we have the right to whip people who do not give their appropriate amount of charity. The authorities, says the Shulchan Aruch, can even seize real estate for the tzedakah payment. The Aruch HaShulchan, that's a 20th century scholar, said, "It is a simple matter that yearly income is calculated from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah. If in this year a person had been doing business in such a way as to have both income and loss, do a general calculation, whatever remains of that person's income, take a tenth for tzedakah. In general, income is considered only actual income. All expenses, food and drink while traveling, are considered business expenses and deductible." Okay, so, right, similar to our contemporary tax code in this country, there are certain things which you don't have to calculate as part of your income for the purpose of figuring out what your tithe is. I also brought Rambam, the laws of the gifts to the poor. I'm not going to read that one to you. I'm going to close with a poem by Khalil Gibran, a Lebanese artist and poet. The poem is called On Giving. Up till now, we've been talking about monetary ways to give. On giving. You give but little when you give of your possessions. It is when you give of yourself that you truly give. You often say, "I would give, but only to the deserving." The trees in your orchard say not so, nor the flocks in your pasture. They give that they may live, for to withhold is to perish. See first that you yourself deserve to be a giver and an instrument of giving. For in truth it is life that gives unto life, while you, who deem yourself a giver, are but a witness. On Giving, by Khalil Gibran. On giving. You give but little when you give of your possessions. It is when you give of yourself that you truly give. You often say, "I would give, but only to the deserving." The trees in your orchard say not so, nor the flocks in your pasture. They give that they may live, for to withhold is to perish. See first that you yourself deserve to be a giver and an instrument of giving. For in truth it is life that gives unto life, while you, who deem yourself a giver, are but a witness. Shabbat Shalom. Okay, we continue with the Musaf service, which can be found with Chatzi Kaddish on page 428, followed by the Amidah for Musaf, page 430. We rise, page 428.
Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabba.
Amen.
Ve'alma divrach yirtei ve'amlik malchutei.
L'chayim chonu u'chayei l'chol Beit Yisrael. Hagala, Hagala, Bizman Kariv, Veimeru, Amen. Yishmei Rabba Mevarach, Le'alam Almei Almaya, Yitbarach.
Yitbarach, v'yishtabach, v'yitpa'ar, v'yitromam, v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar, v'yithalev, v'yithalal, shemei dekudashah, v'rihu. Leila min kol birchata v'shirata,
Tush bechata v'nehemata, damiran me'alma, zimeru, Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu Elohei Avotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel,
זוכר חסדיו, ומגידו לבניהם, למען שמו ויאהב. מלך עוזר ובוקש יושיע מגן. ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם, ובוקש שרה. אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי מתים אתה להושיע. משיב הרוח ומוריד הגשם, מחכה חיים בחסד, מחיי מתים ברחמים רבים. סומך נוכלים ורופא חולים, ומשאיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו, לשני מי כמוך בעל גבורות, ומינו מלך, מלך ממית ומחיה, ומצמיח ישועה, ונאמן אתה לחיות מתים. ברוך אתה אדוני, מחיי המתים. נעריצך ונקדישך כזאת שר.
נעריצך ונקדישך כי סוד שיח שרפי קודש המקדישים שמך בקודש ככתוב על יד נביאיה וקרא זה אל זה ואמר
קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות מלוא כל הארץ כבודו
כבודו מלא עולם משרתיו שואלים זה לזה איה מקום כבודו לעומתם ברוך יאמרו
ברוך כבוד אדוני
ממקומו הוא יפן ברחמים ויחונם המייחדים שמו ערב ובוקר בכל יום תמיד פעמיים באהבה שמה אומרים שמע ישראל אדוני אלוהינו אדוני אחד הוא אלוהינו הוא אבינו הוא מלכנו הוא מושיענו והוא ישמיענו ברחמיו שנפעני כל חי והוא ישמיענו ברחמיו שנפעני כל חי להיות לכם אלוהים אני אדוני אלוהיכם ובדברי קודשך כתוב לאמור
ימלוך אדוני לעולם אלוהי ציון לדור ודור הללויה
לדור ודור נגיד גדלך ולנצח נצחים קדושתך נקדיש לשבחך אלוהינו מפינו לא ימוש לעולם ועד כי המלך גדול וקדוש אתה ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש
you haven't completed your individual whispered Amidah, please continue davening. We join together for Kaddish Shalem, page 506.
Yitgadal v'yitkadosh shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Ve'alma divrach yirutei, ve'amlich machutei, v'chayihon u'vyomechon, u'v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, v'agalav v'zman kari v'yimeru.
Amen. Yehi shmei Rabbah mevarach, le'alam al me'almaya, yitbarach.
Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar v'yithala v'yithala shemei dekudasha. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, v'shpachata v'nechamata, da'amiram be'alma v'yimeru.
Amen.
Titkabal sulot hon uva'od hon, dechol Yisrael kadam avuhon divishmaya v'yimeru.
Amen.
Yehei shlav arava min shemaya, v'chayim alinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimeru.
Amen.
Oseh shalom b'merumav, hu yaseh shalom, alinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimeru.
Amen. Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to Congregation Agudat Achim's in-person and live stream Shabbat morning service. I'm Rabbi Rafi Spitzer. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning to read Parashat Lech Lecha and to study and learn with you and to pray with you on this third Shabbat of our new Torah reading cycle. Yasher Koach to Caitlin for leading us in Musaf, to Dan for chanting the Haftarah, to Marilyn and Steve for reading Torah, and to Alexandra for leading us this morning in Shachri. Congregation wishes a happy birthday to the following individuals who are celebrating their birthday this week. Clifford Tepper, Richard Cohen, Eric Engelmeyer, Danielle Polatsky, Cheryl Ratner, Steve Jarrett, Nancy Kudan, and Ezra Eller Ratner Trachtenberg. Mazel tov and happy birthday to everybody. And also a happy anniversary to Eric and Linnell Engelmeyer, to Eric and Gila Moses, and to Matt and Olivia Friedson, who are all celebrating this week your anniversaries. Happy anniversary to you and many happy returns of the occasion. If there's anything that is going on celebratory in your life, please do share it with us. We'd be happy to celebrate with you in whatever way you think is appropriate, and even to announce your celebratory occasion from the Bima at this time. We want to be together to celebrate and honor the special occasions of our lives. I invite you now to rise for Aleinu, page 510. Kadosh Baruch Hu Shehu Shamayim v'yosed haaretz u'moshav yikaro b'shamayim imah u'shkinatu zo v'gavim u'aleinu einod emet malkeinu efes ulato
Adonai hu ha'Elohim b'shamayim Kakatu b'toratecha, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed.
V'nemar, Raya Adonai, Melech al kol haaretz, Vayom ha'hu, Yeh Adonai echad, U'shemo echad. Congregation offers condolences to Joni Adelson and the whole Adelson family on the death and funeral of Gary Adelson, longtime member of our congregation, who passed away this week. Hamakom Yenachem, we offer you our deepest condolences. The family hasn't decided what Shiva is going to look like over the next few days. If they do decide that they would like to do Shiva, there will be an email coming out so that everybody knows about it. Congregation is also deeply saddened by the death of Chris Parisi, our beloved executive assistant who worked in the office and in the school and who passed away this week. Her funeral will be on Tuesday. The information went out in the email just before Shabbat. There will also be a wake I believe at her family's house. Not at her family's house. Somewhere else. It said it in the email. Yeah. We're deeply, deeply saddened about that. And we offer our condolences to her whole family. Congregation also remembers with love the following individuals who have gone to their eternal rest and whose yahrzeits are this week: Irving Hertzendorf, Meyer Lefkowitz, Herbert Luft, Simon Mushkat, Juliette Rubenstein, Bertika Schulman Kramer, Lazarus Goodheim, Blanche Moses, Harry Happ, Seaman Lertzman, Milton Mincer, Harris Toll, Faye Davis, and Katie Spiegel. In solemn testimony to the unbroken chain of faith which links one generation of the house of Israel to the next, those who mourn and those who are observing Yartzeit now rise to magnify and sanctify God's name with the words of Kaddish Avelim, Mourner's Kaddish, page 512. Yit Gadal, V'yit Kadash, Shemei Rabbah, V'yalma Divra Kirutei, V'yamlich Malchutei, V'chayechon Uvyomechon Uvchayei Dechol Beit Yisrael, Ba'agala Uvizman Kariv V'imru Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevarach Le'alam Lamei Almaya. Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitpa'ar V'yitromam V'yitnasei V'yithadar V'yit'aleh V'yitalal Shmei Dekudesha Brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechmata damiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Now, Jackie's going to offer some announcements on behalf of the congregation.
Let's see. Tomorrow evening at 7:30 is the Men's Club monthly Torah study, and you can contact... When is it? 7:45. And you can talk to Bob about it now or after Shabbat. Let's see. Rabbi, you're canceling your class? Rabbi's Parshat Hashuvah class this week is going to be canceled so that he can attend Chris's funeral. Thursday evening is the fifth in the Steve Burke lecture series, and it's Personality Counts, and it's about the women of Israel. And we have still ongoing is our Scholar Stream, and you can go onto our website and find out all the great stuff that's going on with that. And intermediate Hebrew classes are still going on, and those are on Tuesday evenings at 6. If you're interested in that, you can contact Sephora Harris. And I think that's it. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. This evening at 7 p.m. is a Zoom religious school Havdalah program, which the school board has planned several of these Havdalah programs to do some spiritual gathering outside of regular religious school hours, and they invited me to do to lead and that ritual of Havdalah with the school. That will be tonight at 7 p.m. on Zoom. Also, one other thing that Jackie didn't say is we are in partnership with an organization in Israel that is helping us to feel connected to the land of Israel by supporting Israeli olive farmers. And then it's sort of like a CSA. You pay in at the beginning of the season, and then at the end of the olive growing season, you get some olive oil in the mail. And it's also a fundraiser for the synagogue, because a portion of the cost goes right to Congregation Agudat Achim. So it's win-win-win as far as I'm concerned, for getting olive oil, supporting Israel, and supporting our congregation. Not only are they doing this program that's called My Tree in Israel, but they also want to share with you some of the actual on the ground, what it looks like with the olive trees that are growing now and that are about to enter harvest time. And so they're doing a program at 1 p.m. Tomorrow, Sunday, by Zoom, which you'll actually get, I think, from what their materials said, you actually get to see the olive grove that we are being invited to buy trees in, and to maybe even meet with an olive grower, and definitely to sort of see a hands-on approach of what's going on. So if you're interested in sponsoring a tree and you haven't yet, or if you have already and you just want to learn more about it, there is an opportunity for learning tomorrow at 1. We're going to conclude our service with Adon Olam, page 514.
Adon Olam, Asher Malach, B'terem Kol, Yetzir Nivra, Le'nasa, V'chefso Kol, Azai Melech, Shemonika, Ve'acharei Kiflot HaKol, Levado Yimloch Nora, Ve'hu Haya, Ve'hu Oveh, Ve'hu Yeh, Ve'tifara, Ve'hu Echad, Ve'ein Sheni, Le'am Shilo, Achbira, Ve'li Reshit, Ve'li Tachlit, Elohos, Ve'ham Yisrael, Ve'hu Eli, Ve'ai Goli, Ve'tzor Chevli, Ve'Yisara, Ve'hu Nisi, U'anosli, Ve'natnosi, Ve'yom Ekra, Ve'yado, V'afidrvi, Ve'tisha, Ve'ayira, Ve'yiruchi, Ve'yati, Adonai li, Ve'lo ira, Adon Olam, Asher Malach, B'terem Kol, Yetzir Nivra, Ve'nasa, Ve'chefso Kol, Azai Melech, Shemonika.
Shabbat Shalom.